Okay, this is Miriam, and I'm very happy to introduce Elise LeConte, who is Registrar and Assistant Department Chair at the Florida Museum of Natural History, who's going to talk to us about foundations for our guiding documents, whether they are collections management policies or collections development policies. Elise, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Miriam. Hello, everyone. First, let me say I'm very disappointed not to be there in person in Palmetto. I was really looking forward to meeting my colleagues there. But through the wonders of modern technology, happily I am able to join in on the workshop today. Museums, in some way or another, make their unique contribution to the public by collecting, preserving, and interpreting the things of this world. For the most part, libraries and archives make their unique contribution by collecting, preserving, and sharing information. Although some libraries and archives also hold what we would consider, those of us in the museum world, to be museum-type collections. Museums, libraries, and archives are grounded in the tradition of public service. They are organized as public trust, holding their collections and information as a benefit for those that they were established to serve. The stewardship of collections and information entails the highest public trust and carries with it the presumption of rightful ownership, permanence, at least for museum collections, care, documentation, accessibility, and responsible disposal. In order to fulfill these fiduciary obligations, every cultural institution that owns, cares for, and/or uses collections must have some guiding principles to govern its collections-related activities. A collections policy articulates professional standards regarding collections and serves as a guide for staff and a source of information for the public. In museums, this policy is referred to as a collections management policy. In library and archives, this policy is called a collections development policy. Another type of collections policy is a collections plan. Collections plans are significantly different from collections management or development policies. And further on in the presentation, I'm going to discuss a little bit about what a collections plan is and how it is different from a collections policy, because I find that many times collections professionals confuse the two and use the two terms interchangeably. Now, why should we have collections policies? Without clear direction, poor decisions may be made as to what to collect, how to refuse donations, or how to get rid of collections. Collections policies provide clear guidelines for institutions, governing authorities, staff, and constituents about standards and best practices, as well as legal and ethical requirements related to the sensible acquisition and disposal, care and preservation, security and accountability, and documentation of collections. Collections policies are a tool that can help a museum, library, or archive stick to its mission statement when confronted with confusing, contradictory, or unethical pressures. They define goals for the development and use of the collections. They keep the institution focused on what it is really trying to do. Simply put, they spell out what the institution wants, what it does not want, and what it is going to do with what it has. They prepare an institution to face controversial activities or unexpected eventualities, such as needing to deaccession something or to face a disaster endangering the collection. The best defense against costly mistakes and/or poor decisions is prevention. In today's world, an essential preventive measure is the adoption and implementation of a formal collections management or development policy. The purpose of a collections management or development policy is to minimize risk to the collections. They identify the staff responsible for the collections and provide a framework for collections management. Most importantly, they help the museum, library, or archive to meet their fiduciary responsibilities by enabling the governing authority to meet its legal, ethical, and public trust obligations to protect the collections and make them accessible. Any collections policy should be based on the institution's mission or purpose statement. as well as its scope of collections. Other statements, such as a vision or impact statement, should also influence the content of the policy. The form and content of any collections policy must be tailored to the individual museum, library, or archive. Good collections policies are influenced by the institution's history, community, audiences, governing structure, tradition, and other internal and external policies. It's perfectly fine to review examples from other institutions similar to yours, or to call on colleagues for advice and input. However, the policy will only be successful if it takes into account the specific purpose, organization, and activities of your own institution. To be effective, a collections policy must be simple and easy to abide by. If it is too complex, it becomes difficult or impossible for the staff to follow. Jargon should be avoided, and terms such as collection object, artifact, specimen, and material should be clearly defined. Rules should be stated in a positive manner rather than in a dictatorial manner. The reasons for restrictions should be explained. Doing so will make it easier for staff to understand why they should follow the policy, as well as more inclined to do so. The completed policy must be approved by the entity charged with the overall governance of the institution. This could be somebody like the museum or library director, the board of directors or the trustees, or even a provost or president if the museum, library, or archive is part of a college or university. Once in effect, the policy serves as a formal delegation of responsibilities for all collections-related activities. Collections policies are living documents. They cannot remain stagnant. They are useless if they are outdated or ignored. They should be reviewed and updated on a predetermined periodic basis, say, for example, every 3 to 5 years. They should also be reviewed and updated if the institution undergoes any radical change, like renovation or construction of a new facility, even if that event falls before the time of the regular update. In practice, the collections management or development policy is actually a set of related policies. These core policies include acquisition, deaccession or disposal, collections care, loan, and access and use, which includes access and control of intellectual property rights. These core policies are augmented by other institutional policies such as ethics, emergency preparedness, and collections plans. The committee or team that is appointed to draft the collections management or development policy should include representatives from all areas of the institution that are involved in collections-related activity. Areas like administration, collections, exhibits, education, and security, to name a few. Input from a variety of viewpoints will ensure that the policy supports the institutional mission and that has the support of the staff members who must implement it. Staff should have the opportunity to participate in each stage of the process, including reviewing successive drafts of the policy. Developing a collections management or development policy requires a lot of communication, not only between the committee itself, but between the committee or team and the staff, as well as between the staff and the institution's governing authority. At all times during the development of the policy, do not lose sight of the fact that the objective of creating a collections management or development policy is to define areas of responsibility and guidelines, and not to solve all possible problems. I think this is one area where people get bogged down in the production or development of a policy, is trying to feel like they have to solve every possible problem that might come up or activity. The first step in drafting a collections management or development policy is for the head of the institution, someone like the director, to assemble a committee or team and appoint the committee chair or team leader. Then the team makes a careful review of current legal, ethical, and professional standards and best practices in order to determine which have an impact on collections-related activities, and should therefore guide the development of the policy. The team or committee should also review all of the other institutional policies that the museum or library or archive have at the time of the drafting of the collections policy to see how they will impact the development of the policy. Once that step is complete, the committee or team writes a final draft, a first draft. The draft is circulated to all of the institution staff for review and comment. It may also be shown to the governing authority, say the board of directors or trustees, for their input. The committee or team revises the original draft based on the comments they receive. The new draft is circulated to all staff for further review and comment. This process is repeated until a consensus is reached and the committee or team deems the draft ready to be presented to the governing authority for final approval. The final document is then presented to the institution's governing authority for formal approval. A collections management policy is a written document approved by the governing authority that specifies the museum's policies concerning all collections-related issues, including accessioning, documentation, storage, and disposition. A good collections management policy covers both a broad range of topics, including but not limited to those things that you see on the screen. So a description of the museum's collections and collection-related goals, acquisition, accessioning, and deaccessioning criteria, outgoing and incoming loans, management of non-accessioned objects in the custody of the museum, care of the collections, documentation and record-keeping systems, insurance and risk management, collections inventories, reproduction, copyright, and other legal and ethical issues related to the collections, access to the collections, and review and revision of the policy. If you want to see this list in more detail, it is covered on page 4 of our text by Simmons, Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies. A collections development policy is a detailed written document approved by the governing authority that regulates the library or archive's collections-related activities, including accessioning, documentation, storage, and weeding. And I'd like to point out here that weeding is similar to deaccession in museums. It's just done in a slightly different way, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. Our text by Hoffman and Wood, Library Collection Development Policies, Academic, Public, and Special Libraries, has an extensive list of the components of a collections development policy on page 3, and you see some of that list here. I'd like to point out some of the points or sections, components that are different from a museum collections management policy. Things like a purpose statement and a background statement, a statement about the target audiences. Of course, both types of policies talk about mission of the institution, goals, and objectives. Another component that we don't often have in museum policies is a statement on resource sharing. Perhaps this is something we should look into. Both types of policies tend to have copyright statements or statements about intellectual property rights. And again, the collections development policy has what is referred to as a weeding statement, or what we would refer to in museums as a deaccession policy. So what are the differences? I've mentioned some, but the major difference between museum collections management policies and library archives collections development policies has to do with the fact that museums have to collect or have to accept collections in perpetuity. That is one of their goals. There are very strict regulations that guide the deaccessioning or disposal of collections. This means that in order to uphold its fiduciary responsibilities to the public it serves, A museum's deaccessioning policy must be approved by the highest level of the museum's governing authority. Now, that's not to say that a library or archive collection development policy does not have to be approved by the governing authority. But in museums, our actual deaccession policy and deaccession activities have to be approved at that highest level. For libraries and archives, the disposal of materials from the collection is also guided by regulations laid out in the collections development policy. However, it is usually the librarian who has direct oversight of the collection that is delegated as the authority to make decisions about what to read. Now, for collections plans. A collections plan is a much different document than a collections management or development policy. A collections plan establishes a vision for the collection that best serves the institution's mission, compares the existing collections to that vision, and maps out how the institution will achieve the ideal collections that match its vision. A collections plan is not a set of guidelines like a collections management or development policy. It is a strategic plan that maps out the institution's goals and objectives related to its collections activities, lays out the steps necessary to fulfill the indicated goals and objects, and identifies the resources, both financial and human, that are needed to achieve the indicated goals and objectives. As I mentioned earlier, a common mistake that I encounter often in interactions with other museums is that the staff do not know the difference between policies, plans, and procedures. We've talked about the difference between a plan and a policy, and now policies and procedures. Policies establish the standards that regulate an institution's activities. Plans map out goals and objectives that help institutions evolve and meet the challenges laid out for them in their policies. Although a collections management or development policy must change as the institution or professional standards and best practices evolve, they are not inherently time-limited. A collections plan, on the other hand, is an ongoing process of deciding the museum's specific activities. It specifies what will be accomplished in a given period, why, by whom, and with what resources. And I'm sorry if I confused you there by saying earlier that we were going to talk about the difference between a policy and a procedure. That was the difference between a policy and a plan. Now for the difference between policies and procedures. Policies supply the standards for decision-making and the guidelines for taking action in a given situation. They must be approved by the appointed governing authority as that person or leadership body that is legally and ethically accountable for the museum's actions. Procedures, on the other hand, specify the mechanisms and details needed to implement the policy. Procedures are subject to frequent revision, and appropriate staff members have the authority to change them. So again, the two main differences are that procedures are revised frequently and that the staff member actually using the procedures has the authority to change it, whereas the staff member does not have the authority to change a policy without the input from the governing authority. Because procedures are subject to frequent revision and do not need to undergo the rigorous formal approval process that policies do, procedures should be set down in separate documents that can be easily altered whenever the need arises and by whomever is responsible for overseeing the activities for which the procedures are needed. Another common mistake I see when I consult with other museums on collections management policies is that what they've done is actually created a set of procedures rather than an actual policy. So that's it for me. Does anybody have any questions?
This is Miriam, and this is the moment where the facilitator in any of the 4 regions can take the mic. If you've got somebody in the room, if they want to come stand near the mic and ask their question directly, that would be great. or you can put you can put your comments in the chat box, and Elise and I can both see what's popping up in the chat box there. So let me shut my mic off and see if anybody has a question, and I'm asking that same question.
I see that Christy has a question about the collections plan. Yes, that again is developed similarly to a collections policy, where you have a team of people representing different areas of the museum, especially those related to all the different collections activities. And because it involves financial support from the museum itself or the institution, it does have to be approved by the governing authority.
Elise, there's a question from Linda Deaton in Tallahassee.
Right. I see that Linda asked about collections plan being referred to as strategic plans. The reason in museums that we call them something different is that we usually have institutional strategic plans which address the institution as a whole and all the different workings of the museum. And so within that larger institutional strategic plan, or as a separate document, the collections plan address only the goals, objectives, and resources needed to address collections activities rather than other types of activities within the museum.
Elise, Robin asked the question, if you have a wish list of the kinds of objects that you would want to have in your collection, which document would that go into?
Good question, Robin. A wish list would go into, I think, a collections plan. It's things that you want to get. Now, the scope of collections, and that'll be talked about later, I believe, today. The scope of collections will guide the development of a wish list. Also, the collections policy, the mission statements, the vision statements of the museum will guide the development of a wish list. But because the objects are not yet within the purview of the museum, or not yet owned or procured by the museum, they shouldn't be included in a policy. I think the plan would be a better place for them. And I'm trying to read Christy's question now. I'm going to turn off my mic for just a second.
This is Miriam, and I'm going to go ahead and paraphrase the question so everybody has it, even if they can't see the little tiny type in the chat box. But there are, in our 4 regions, there are many organizations that have both museum collections, the museum has a library, and then the museum also has an archive. Do you put all of this together in one policy, or do you think of these as different policies? This is Miriam again, and then I'll pass the mic over to Elise for some comments on this. The question of you have all 3, library, archive, and museum collections in one institution, and do you mush them all into one policy, or do you keep them separate? I think as much as possible you keep them separate, because you make different kinds of decisions. And as an institution, the foundational piece here is what needs to be reviewed and approved by the board. When you take collections in a museum setting, you are making a financial commitment to that collection in perpetuity. That is a governing board or a governing authority decision. If you have a library, you need to look carefully at whether or not that library is integrated into your in perpetuity collection. And some books and resource materials are, but some are not. And if you have an archive, again, is this an archive that is an archive in the library sense, or is this an archive that is an archive in a permanent in perpetuity collection sense? And this is one of those moments where the answer might be different depending on your institution and organization. And Elise, do you want to chime in on this one for a moment?
Yes, I'm sorry, Miriam. I had started to talk, and I realized when you came in that my mic was turned off. So I agree with your answer about that, and I would say especially for plans as opposed to policies, since each section of the institution would have might have different goals. The archive part of the institution might have a different goal than the museum section of the institution, for example. Then I think it's really important for each of those sections to have a separate plan, because they may have different goals and objectives. They may need different resources. They may have a lot of similarities, but each department, should we say, will have to focus on what they need as opposed to what the other department needs. I do think that if separate policies are created, they should be compared across the institution and take into account that ultimately it's the institution's responsibility, and the administrators and the governing authority for the institution that are responsible for seeing that the policies work and that they're followed. So it's a good thing to, if you do have separate policies, to make sure that they all interrelate and that they're coherent with each other. I see Robin has a question about the best way to handle an institution that might have a committee of one. And again, this is a great question because we know in Florida that many museums have only a volunteer staff, maybe. Only one person running the whole museum or library or archive and doing everything by themselves. I think in this case, it's a good thing to call on your colleagues when you could create a committee to help with the development of the policy by calling on volunteers from the community, using whoever's in charge of the museum, say the trustees or someone from the board of directors. Pull in colleagues from other institutions that have institutions similar to yours and would be able to give you advice or help you with the development of the policy. I do know some places that have actually used consultants to help them write the policies. This is another way to do it, but you have to make sure that the consultant really understands what the institution is all about, what types of collections they have, how they operate, what their structure is, their governing structure, what their internal structure is. You have to be really careful that you don't get a product that doesn't fit with your institution.
This is Miriam, and I'm going to jump in with a, I agree, absolutely agree with everything Elise just said, and because I saw a lot of head shaking, oh, there's only one of me here at in Manatee County, and a lot of people in the room here are from those small kinds of institutions. The answer, another way to frame the answer is that your responsibility is to the collection, and to the collection, and this is particularly important for the museum collections, is that your responsibility is in perpetuity. So that while it might be expedient to kind of mush things together, you are doing the organization a disservice in the long term. So yes, look for help and look for resources. Look to work collaboratively with some of your colleagues at other, here in Manatee County, the process that they're using is that a group of smaller historical societies are working on these documents together to help each other do this so that everybody's not working individually. But the bottom line is that if you are a museum, you have made a commitment to collections in perpetuity, and part of your responsibilities, and I'm going to put it in a different kind of way, which is that museum ethics, and we'll talk about ethics in the third workshop, but nonprofits hold a special status in our communities, and part of why museums hold that special status is because we have made a commitment to those collections in perpetuity, and this is one of the foundational documents for that. So that this is one of those moments when I'm going to say, start to put things down on paper, start to develop your policy, indeed, you don't revise a policy every couple of weeks, but get going on it, and if you can get part of it reviewed and approved, that's better than nothing. So this is, as we talked about in the emergency planning process, don't try to be absolutely perfect down to every T and I, but get going on it for those smaller organizations. So I'm going to turn the mic back over to Elise for the next question.
Miriam and everyone else, I'd like to make a comment too about, for museums anyway, I'm sure people know that AAM has an accreditation program, and they have now developed what they call core documents, and it's the set of core documents, one of which includes the collections management policy, that have to be written and approved before a museum can be considered for accreditation. I don't know about libraries and archives. I tried to find some information on that and wasn't successful, so maybe one of our library colleagues can talk to that.
Joy from, this is Miriam, and Joy from Buck Towers is confirming that there is not the same kind of accreditation process in the library and archive. And maybe Dean DeVolt in Tallahassee or Scott Reinke in Miami want to make a comment here, or anyone else for that matter. We've got some other presentations coming up that continue to address some of these differences as we go forward today. So we'll be talking about that over the course of the 3 workshops. This is Miriam again. But and I will confess that as we were planning this, we had a moment of saying, does the fact that one works in perpetuity and the other does not mean that we should not be all around the conference room table? And what's really clear as we looked at these questions really closely is that the rest of the processes, the rest of the things that you have to think about, the way in which you go about working, the care for those collections, when it is a special collection in a library, remain the same. And I'm making a distinction here between the public library and the special collection. And many people who are participants in this program might indeed work in a public library, but they are responsible for special collections. And I think a way that I have found useful to think about that is that at the public library, the book gets wet, it goes in the dumpster. You buy a new book. The special collection, the book gets wet, you put resources and time and energy into preserving the book because it holds a special record that you want to keep. So that's a way of thinking about the difference between the two. So let me ask if anybody else wants to make a comment on this, or if anybody has another question. I've got Joy here who's going to make a question, and I'm hoping the mic will pick up her voice.
Maybe this will be addressed some other time, but I'm at Box Tower Gardens, and one of the conversations that has been going on quite a bit is whether or not we want to be a museum. There are some who have considered us to be one, but we have not behaved in a manner that would reflect that necessarily, and because we don't have any policies right now. We don't accession materials. I oversee a library and an institutional archive, but there are other collections. And so I'm wondering how to address that. Certainly there are qualities that we have that make us seem like a museum, but in developing these policies, I'm not entirely sure that the governing board wants us to put that on paper.
Wow, that's really interesting, Joy. That's an interesting situation. And my one comment about it, I guess my first comment would be that's really something, whether or not you're going to act like a museum, that the people at the top, you know, the governing authority, the top administrators at your institution, they have to decide that first. But my other comment is that, you know, whether or not you choose to act as an archive in a library or a museum, It's important to have policies and to have them written down on paper. They are guiding documents, as I said. They can serve to help you move through a problem, or if something unethical comes up. I mentioned all that in my talk, but whatever kind of institution you are, policies are really important to help you just operate on a day-to-day basis. And I'm sure maybe Miriam has some more comments she can make about that.
I've also worked with a lot of institutions where the writing of the policy and then the review of the policy at different levels up the food chain was a real educational moment, and that in thinking through the issues of policies, people came to conclusions that sometimes surprised them, because as they learned more and they understood the implications of what they were doing, they started to make decisions. So that I would say that I fully agree with Elise that this is ultimately a question for a governing authority. But for a staff member, simply by sort of saying, okay, I'm not going to get an answer to the big picture question right away, that doesn't mean that you can't get to work and start putting things in place with some assumptions that seem to make sense with you, and really use it as an opportunity to teach others. So this is Miriam. I'm going to see if anybody else has comments or questions. That was a great question. Thanks, Joy. One question that came up here from Phaedra is, what do you do when your board is not well versed in developing policies? And this is Miriam, and I'm going to answer that by saying that serving on a board comes with responsibilities. Being a staff member comes with the responsibility of educating your board and helping them understand why your organization is different than other nonprofits on whose boards they might have served, and why they really need to pay attention to these issues in a different kind of way than they might for a different organization. So this is all part of, I liken it to an educational cycle where you recognize where some of the weaknesses are and you start to tackle them in small bites, and not say, I'm going to throw up my hands because they don't know any better. I think it's really the education process. Others?
Miriam, that's a great comment, and I agree. I was going to say what I like to do is, again, as you said, break it up into small bites and do little training sessions, either as part of a board meeting, 15, 20-minute presentation like we did today and like we did with the emergency plans, but broken down into these small, 15 to 20-minute time periods. Give them tours of the collections areas, or tours of the exhibit areas, or tours of the archives. Engage them in your activities. You could have a volunteer day. I know that board members are often very stressed and very busy, so volunteering sometimes isn't always an option, but you could do a little, a Saturday 2-hour cleanup of the storage room, or, the collection storage room, or something like that. But it's important to get the board engaged and, as Miriam said, to educate them, and it can be done in a way that doesn't turn them off.
This is Miriam. I'm going to add that everyone is welcome to use these presentations that we are recording, for example, Elise's session that just finished, as well as the Q&A, and these are things that you can bring to your board for one of these mini training moments. I think that we've covered a huge number of questions. I'm going to say huge thanks to Elise, who I know remains online and available for questions as the day goes on.